So go ahead and turn to a clean page in your notebook. Put today's date. And today is the 23rd of August. And this must, because it got unplugged, it's taking a little bit longer. But the title of this story is Fireflies. Fireflies. And remember that one of the things that we want to do, okay, so we're up. There we go. One of the reasons why we're reading some mentor texts is because, let's hope that comes up a little bit brighter. The reason why we want to listen to and study mentor texts is because good writers learn from other good writers. And so as we're reading a story, we can read a story like with our writer's caps on, with our writer's ears and our writer's mind, and we're looking specifically at how the story was told. We're not so much concerned about what happens in the story as we are how the author crafts it, how the author writes it, what the author does. The author of this book is Julie Brinklow, and you spell her last name B-R-I-N-C-K-L-O-E. And one of the things that you're going to notice as I read through this story is the way that Julie Brinklow uses sensory details to craft her story. On a summer evening, I looked up from dinner through the open window to the backyard. So remember, at the beginning of a story, we're orienting the reader. I heard a great analogy for this. If you've ever gone to spend the night someplace else, whether that's a hotel or whether that's a friend's house, a vacation house, if you wake up in the middle of the night, you may be disoriented as to knowing where you are because the environment is not familiar to you like your room is. And so a lot of times you'll have to switch on the light to orient yourself, remind yourself where you are, where the furniture is, how to get to the bathroom, okay? And it's the same with a story. When you first open up to the very first page in a story, you really don't know where you are. And it's the job of the author to orient you so that you get an idea of when and where this is taking place. So we already know it's a summer evening. We already know that it's probably very comfortable outside because the window is open. So it's not too cold and it's not too hot. We also know that the person is sitting at the dinner table eating their dinner. So it's in the evening, probably starting to get dark. And they obviously live in a home that has a backyard. Okay, all of that information just from one sentence. It was growing dark. My treehouse was a black shape in the tree, and I wouldn't go up there now. But something flickered there a moment. I looked, and it was gone. It flickered again over near the fence. Fireflies. "Don't let your dinner get cold," said Mama. I forked the meat and corn and potatoes into my mouth. "Please, may I go out? The fireflies." Mama smiled and Daddy nodded. "Go ahead," they said. I ran from the table down to the cellar to find a jar. I knew where to look, behind the stairs. The jars were dusty, and I polished one clean on my shirt. Then I ran back up 2 steps at a time. And you can stop and kind of notice when someone is running up 2 steps at a time, you can infer what they're feeling. So notice again, the author is showing us those feelings through the action of the character. Holes, I remembered, so they can breathe. And as quietly as I could, so she wouldn't catch me dulling them, I poked holes in the top of the jar with Mama's scissors. The screen door banged behind me as I ran from the house. So notice, telling the story bit by bit, including all of these sensory details, because we're writing about this small moment of going out and catching fireflies. If someone said, "Don't slam it," I wasn't listening. I called to my friends in the street, "Fireflies," but they had come before me with polished jars, and others were coming behind. The sky was darker now. My ears rang with crickets and my eyes stung from staring too long. I blinked hard as I watched them. Fireflies, blinking on, blinking off, dipping low, soaring high above my head, making white patterns in the dark. We ran like crazy, barefoot in the grass. Catch them, we cried, grasping at the lights. Suddenly, a voice called out above the others, "I caught one!" And it was my own. I thrust my hand into the jar and spread it open. The jar glowed like moonlight, and I held it in my hands. I felt a tremble of joy and shouted, "I can catch hundreds." Then we dashed about, waving our hands in the air like nets, catching 2, 10, hundreds of fireflies, thrusting them into jars, waving our hands for more. Then someone called from my house, "It's time to come in now." And others called from other houses, and it was over. my friends took jars of fireflies to different homes. I climbed the stairs to my room and set the jar on a table by my bed. Mama kissed me and turned out the light. I caught hundreds, I said. Daddy called from the hallway. See you later, alligator. After a while, crocodile, I called back. I caught hundreds of fireflies. In the dark, I watched the fireflies from my bed. They blinked off and on, and the jar glowed like moonlight. But it was not the same. The fireflies beat their wings against the glass and fell to the bottom and lay there. The light in the jar turned yellow, like a flashlight left on too long. I tried to swallow, but something in my throat would not go down. And the light grew dimmer, green like moonlight underwater. I shut my eyes tight and put the pillow over my head. They were my fireflies. I caught them. They made moonlight in my jar, but the jar was nearly dark. I flung off the covers. I went to the window, opened the jar, and aimed it at the stars. Fly. Then the jar began to glow. Green, then gold, then white as the moon, and the fireflies poured out into the night. Fireflies, blinking on, blinking off, dipping low, soaring high above my head, making circles around the moon like stars dancing. I held the jar, dark and empty, in my hands. The moonlight and the fireflies swam in my tears. But I could feel myself smiling. So here again we have another story, another small moment story that the author tells. Remember the things that we've collected so far, telling the story bit by bit, including lots of details that help us to slow down the pace of the story, get us to feel something, because that's what a writer wants, is for their reader to feel something, to feel an emotion. Okay. All right, so that is our mentor text for today. What I'd like you to do next is to go ahead. I passed out a rubric for you. I should say a checklist, excuse me. A narrative writing checklist. If you could turn it over and write your name on the back of it. Now, our unit of study in writing actually provides us with a narrative writing checklist. The only problem is that it is really long and wordy. And I am going to share it with you today just because I think it's important for you to actually see what it looks like. But I want to just let you know that the items that are contained in this checklist are on your little sheet, your smaller sheet. I've reduced them to something that's less wordy. And we're going to be using that today. So we talk a lot about the things that we need to be doing as good readers and writers. And one of the things we always talk about is that we want to get better. No matter where we are today as a writer, we want our writing to get better. Even if we're just taking little baby steps forward, as long as we're moving forward and not staying in the same place, okay, it's a good thing. Now, one of the things that I a lot of times will give an analogy to something just to help you to understand what I'm talking about. My granddaughter, Vanessa, which a lot of you have seen, she has a T-ball set up so that she can practice hitting baseballs and softballs so that she can practice and learn how to swing, okay? Well, that's great for someone who's in kindergarten, who's trying to learn how to swing a bat and hit a ball and aim for a ball. But if you saw a Major League Baseball player get up to bat with the T from T-ball, okay, it would look pretty silly, okay? We expect that sometime between T-ball and the major leagues that somebody would learn how to hit the ball without the T, okay? We would expect that somebody would grow and get better at what they were doing, okay? And the same is true for reading and writing and actually for all of your subject areas. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the narrative writing rubric, and I will share it with you on the screen. And if you feel, as we go through it, if you feel like you need to add anything because what's written on the checklist that we're using is not going to be enough for you as far as knowing what it means, then you're welcome to add anything that you want to. Okay, so there you go. So when we take a look at the narrative writing checklist, you can see it's quite a long and extensive and very wordy type of a checklist. I tried to put things in kind of a logical order as well. But the first thing you're going to notice is that we talk about structure. Okay, so we talk about how right now what we're working on is writing a small moment story. We're writing a story of an important moment, and it reads like a story. Even though it's something that really happened, it reads like a story. So as you're writing, your writing is going to resemble the mentor text that we've been reading because we've been reading stories. Then we talk about how you begin. I wrote a beginning in which I not only showed what was happening and where, but also gave some clues to what would later become a problem for the main character. So that part right there, that part about the lead, that's about orienting the reader. We just talked about that a little bit earlier, okay? And on your checklist, you can see it says, I wrote a beginning that showed what was happening and where. My beginning hinted at the problem. All right, then the next checklist. I used transitional phrases to show the passage of time. After dinner. in the evening, before I went outside. All right, so we have some examples here on our checklist because our reader, remember, wants to know the passage of time. So if we look at our fireflies, we had that it was growing darker. At first it was just starting to get dark, and then by the time they finished collecting their fireflies, it was quite dark. All right, the passage of time. All right, then you writing an ending that connects to the main part of the story, meaning that your ending is going to be helping you to get your message across. Your character is going to realize something. In our story, Fireflies, the character realizes that even though he wants to keep and hold on to these beautiful fireflies, they're going to die. They're going to die in the jar. That they're not the same as they were when they were out and flying freely. And so he has to make that really difficult decision, that decision that causes him to cry. And he opens that jar up and he lets the fireflies fly free. Okay, so the ending kind of goes back to the main part. Gets that message across. Your reader should also feel a sense of closure. There's nothing that is left unanswered. Or if it is, it's more like a wondering. I think about some of the stories that we've read in the past. Chris Van Allsburg always likes to kind of leave you wondering because that's one of his themes, and he does that theme all the time, wondering about something that could be magical, something that seems like it might not be possible, and wondering. Okay, the last part in structure, the last part in the structure of the of your story is using paragraphs. Now, we've talked about this before. We talked about this last year, if you were with me last year at the end of the year. Knowing where to do paragraphs in narrative writing is very different than when you're writing an essay. Okay? So, you create a new paragraph as people are talking. So, for example, if Claire was talking first, her dialogue would be in a paragraph. If Caroline answered her, a new paragraph would start. And I always, because I love to do analogies, think about when you watch television or a movie. You probably have noticed that the camera shifts. Okay, the camera doesn't just stay in one place, but it shifts. So when Claire is talking, the camera is on her. When Caroline goes to talk, the camera switches to Caroline. Okay? And if you think in those terms about whenever the camera shifts, you know when to start a new paragraph. Another time you start a new paragraph is if someone new walks in the door. Okay, we're having our class here. We all hear the door. The door opens. Everybody looks at the door. Okay, the camera shifts. Everybody looks at the door. And so we know that a new paragraph would start. Changing the setting also would cause for a camera shift, a new paragraph. We're in class. We're learning. It's time for recess. We get up and we go out to a new setting. Camera shifts, new paragraph. Okay? Now, as I've walked around and looked at a lot of the drafts that you have in your notebooks, what I'm seeing is like block of writing. Okay? I'm seeing no paragraphs. All right? And that's okay when you're drafting quickly and you're not really thinking, you're just trying to get the words down, okay? It's a rough draft, all right? But we want to start getting automatic with that, starting a new paragraph whenever that camera shifts. Dialogue, someone new talks, someone new enters the story, setting shifts. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into the section that's called development. And what they mean by development is how it's crafted, how it's written. Okay? When you're writing your story, you need to make sure that you are doing like sprinkling and blending things. You don't want to just say, I was at my house. I was sitting at the table. I was looking out the window. The window was open. Okay? Think about the beginning of our story, Fireflies, and the way that the author kind of blended that information in the sentence. On a summer evening, I looked up from dinner through the open window to the backyard. So all of that information is in there, but it's blended. It says, I developed characters, setting, and plot. Remember what plot is. That's the series of events in a story. Throughout my story, especially the heart of the story. That's that most intense moment. If you use a story mountain, it's the peak of the mountain. If you use a story arc, it's the top part just as things start to get better. To do this, I used a blend of description, action, dialogue, and thinking. That's the inner thinking of the character. What is going on in that character's mind? I showed why my characters did what they did by including their thinking and their responses to what happened. So how are they reacting to that? How did our boy in our Fireflies story react when the light started to go dim? You wouldn't understand how difficult that was if the author didn't talk about him trying to swallow and having a hard time. I included precise details and used figurative language so that readers could picture the setting, characters, and events. I used some objects or actions as symbols to bring forth my meaning. Okay? And guys, a lot of these things that we include in our narrative writing are part of our standards. And if you put that down, it would be helpful for you to focus. They're part of our reading standards. So you really become the master of that standard. You master that standard when you're able to do it in your own work. When you're able to create it in your own work. Then in the development, I varied my sentences to create the pace and tone of my narrative. When your sentences become very short and quick, the reader gets an idea that things are happening very quickly and intensely. When the sentences are longer, it slows down the action. So we don't want our sentences all to be the same, because varying our sentences helps to create that tone and pace. And if you're not sure about what we're talking about when we're talking about varying your sentences, remember that you have a chart in your packet, in your green packet, on how we can vary sentences, make the sentences very different from each other. All right, the last of these pieces on our checklist have to do with conventions. And I want you to notice how much they focus on spelling and using a dictionary if you need to, if you don't know how to spell something. But they also talk about commas. 5th grade standards for language is very heavy in commas and understanding. You have a chart for commas in your reference packet. Okay, and we have dictionaries in the back, in the bottom cubbies, should you need to use one. Okay, so basically, the things that are written on this big, long, complicated checklist are also written on your shorter half-sheet checklist. Now, what we're going to do today is we are going to, let me just shift it over here a little bit. You are going to, with a partner, you are going to sit down and your partner is going to have your checklist and you are going to read your story to your partner. No matter how much of the story you have done, okay? So if you have finished it, great. Then you can get to those pieces on here that have to do with closure and endings. But if you've only gotten to a certain point, just look at the checklist. After you've shared, discuss with your partner the goals that you could create for yourself and ways that you could go back to your seat to revise your work so that all of the items would be completed. So if you weren't really good about including sensory details or telling it bit by bit or varying your sentences, your goal could be to vary your sentence. And when you go back to work at your desk by yourself, you can begin to vary your sentences. And remember, you can use a sticky note, you can use white space, but try not to erase and rewrite because it's very powerful for you to see, Fiona, it's very powerful for you to see where your writing was before and how much it improved through revision. Does anybody have any questions before you start working? I'm going to let you choose your partner, but I am going to ask you to choose wisely because you know if the partner that you choose is going to keep you off task or help you to stay on task. And you want to be able to be on task and focused. You're only going to get better if you have a really good goal to work towards. So please make sure you choose wisely. Once the first partner shares, then it's the other person's chance to go. So when you're done, you each should have a goal that you are going to try to achieve in your writing today. You may sit around the room when you're working. However, I would appreciate it if you would stay social distanced. That means 2 squares between you and the other person. All right, go ahead and choose your partners and get to work.